Is we will continue on as far as we can. We're going to do lecture number 6 today, which was for last week. In theory, we were going to get to lecture 9 before we had the midterm. I'm not sure about that now. So let me tell you a little about the midterm too before we get started. And if you're curious about questions, I actually put a couple questions in the lecture so that the iClicker poll will actually be a couple sample questions so you can see. If you're curious what's going to be on the midterm, do go check the course website, the landing page. But just to remind you, the thing you'll want to do is make sure you've done all the readings. And by that, I mean all the readings. So there are things, people are talking, and this is like, you want to know this material. There are some readings that we have not covered in the reader that you should have read. An example would be John Perlin's A Forest Journey, which gave you background on Mesopotamia and deforestation. I didn't cover that because I just wanted you to have the background so we could have the discussion. But it is important, and it's quite possible you could be tested on that. So make sure you've read everything in the reader. Mostly it'll be primary points, but also let me give you a little clue on how I come up with questions. Some people, well, I have to take into account that there's some people who aren't going to do the readings or are going to do plot summaries of the readings or try something online to give you an overview of it. So to make sure that you actually do the readings, I will sometimes ask specific questions from the readings, things that you would never get from a plot summary. So if you think you'll get by with a plot summary, it just won't work because the questions are going to be kind of specific. They won't be difficult, but they will require you to have actually read it. So you have until next Thursday. Regardless if we push things back or whatever, the exam will be next Thursday. The only difference is now it may or may not include lecture number 9 if I get to it. The other thing, make sure you actually watch all of the videos, the documentaries. I know people think that sometimes you can make a comment on YouTube without actually having watched it, read some other comments, put it together, make your own. Okay, maybe that works for the comments, but it will not work because the same thing is going to happen. I'll ask kind of specific questions from the videos to make sure that you've watched them. How do you prepare for that? I mentioned the first day of class. Go to GauchoCast, where most of them are from, and you can then go ahead and look at the closed captioning file and read through it very quickly as a way of preparing. So that you need to do. You also need to make sure that you've listened to all the lectures, and if you've not noticed, as soon as the class is over, within like 24 hours, the lectures are up on the course website. There is also a version up on GauchoCast. I think one got missed, but the place to watch them would be on the course website where they've been uploaded to YouTube. So if you missed a lecture, I would go do that. Even if you haven't, if you want to prepare, the thing to do would be to go to YouTube and to look at the transcript, and you could see everything that I say. So everything I'm saying right now is going to be up on YouTube using voice recognition like that. So that's how it'll work. The fourth thing that you have to remember to review is the little videos that I do introducing the films. So like Merchants of Doubt, Climate of Doubt, that little YouTube introduction, it's only like 5, 6, 7 minutes long. There could be questions on those too, because I want you to actually not just watch the video, but see, my framing of it or some background and introductory material. So that's what I would do to prep. Like I said, when we go through lecture 6, you'll see a couple sample questions to give you an idea of the format, the kind of questions we'll have. So why don't I jump right into number 6 then? Notice that we're still here basically in the same historical period, Roman period, and we're going to start with something called pastoral. Let's see if this little clicker works. Yep. So pastoral, why we're going to spend a good bit of the class on it, it's without doubt the most common form of nature writing in the West. It's been around formally for 2,000 years, but even goes back further than that. We're going to see an example of essentially pastoral writing from 2,700 years ago with Sappho. So we're going to spend a good bit of time with it. And again, because it's just such an important form of nature writing, it's incredibly pervasive. Every century after this, it will show up, often in a big way. We'll talk about why it shows up in a big way. And we'll also talk about what it reveals about a culture's relationship to the planet. So, just to be very clear, so you understand it, it is not a literary genre. So what do I mean by a genre? It would be a type of literature. A play is a genre, a poem is a genre, a novel is a genre, but it's rather what we would call a mode of writing. And what that means is you can have pastoral across any of these genres. So we're actually going to read a pastoral play, which is Shakespeare's As You Like It. You can have an elegy. When someone dies, you write an elegy. Milton's Lycidas would be an example. Even Thoreau's Walden, which we're going to read from, which is kind of a novel, kind of autobiographical, kind of a mix of a bunch of lectures, even that can be pastoral too. So just don't think that pastoral is like poetry, like a specific genre of literature. It can be anything. You can go across anything. And I want to show you some examples of it. It's not even limited to literature. It can be different forms of art. It can be music, and I'll show you, or you can listen to an example in a minute of some music. Take many forms. It needn't be a work of literature at all. There are pastoral paintings, even pastoral music. So see if I can get this playing. You've probably heard this already, I'm thinking. Let's see if it works. Oh, sorry, this one comes next. Wonderful poem. Sappho, 7th century before the Christian era. Come to me here from Crete to this holy temple where your lovely apple grove stands and your altars that flicker with incense, and below the apple branches, cold, clear waters, everything shadowed by roses, and sleep that falls from bright shaking leaves, and a pasture for horse blossoms with flowers of spring, and breezes are flowing like honey. Come to me here. So why is this pastoral? Just listen to that scene. And you can actually, it's being described here, right? The apple branches, everything is shadowed by roses. So there are rose vines up on top of where she is here, and the sun is kind of coming through it. But you're encouraged to listen to the clear water sounds. So there's a little sort of babbling brook nearby. It's meant to be a wonderful, what we would call a nature scene. If you could go to a park and you wound up with something this wonderful, yeah, wouldn't that be a wonderful place to be? And we're going to see again and again people will depict scenes like this. The interesting question is why they depict them and what it means when they are depicting them. So Sappho, writing in 7th century, this is before the formal introduction of pastoral by Theocritus, which we'll get to. A little tidbit here on Sappho. You may have heard of her. It's interesting because it's an incredibly, powerful poem, same-sex poem. She lived on the Isle of Lesbos, so if you ever wondered where, the Sappho connection to Sapphic literature, or even the word lesbian, it comes from Sappho, because people for a large portion of the West will associate same-sex poetry and literature with Sappho, and then where she lived becomes the word in the 19th century, lesbian, to describe people from Lesbos, even though it's not, it was associated primarily with her. Okay, so music. This is, you may have seen it, maybe not for a while. This is Disney's Fantasia, but the song being played here is an incredibly elaborate pastoral poem, which has the name Pastoral. This is an image of a pastoral scene. So what that was about, Beethoven is trying to put into musical phrases what it would feel like to be in a pastoral place. We saw Sappho doing it with her poetry, trying to imagine that. And then, of course, the Disney studio tried to imagine that music visually. What would like an imaginative pastoral scene be? And what they land on is that harvest festival. So they're harvesting grapes and making wine. That's pretty typical, by the way. We're going to see when we get to Theocritus, who does the first formal pastoral, he's going to use a harvest festival. This is another example, and this is from the 19th century in the US, in the South, from the 1860s. And we're going to talk about this particular scene here. If I can make this go away. Hold on. Okay. So let's jump to the next section. You see why I never play videos, because it always messes up my Prezi. Okay, so here we are. Hold on a second. I think I have to mute this for a moment and launch the iClicker, which will be coming up, which I had neglected to do, but I will do now. iClicker, launching. Start class. Okay, back again. So let's go to the first one here. This would be an example of an exam question. Select and go. So this is your iClicker. We're actually taking roll here at the same time, but this is a question from the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is a good example of a question that requires you to have actually read the material. If you haven't read it, this question is impossible, basically, because what is Enkidu? Notice I didn't give you anything like, describe anything other than identify Enkidu. And let's hope that you know which it is from here. Again, it's not a difficult question, but people who haven't done the reading. So 500, 600 people have done it. Let's see if you all know the answer. Yes. Not everyone does, however. Some people are saying the formal name for the cedar forest. Some people are saying Gilgamesh's god. Fewer people, look at that. People are changing their opinions right now. It is Gilgamesh's friend, this wild man named Enkidu. So what is the lesson from this? The lesson is, please do the reading. This doesn't count. The fact that you got it wrong, if you thought it was the cedar forest, that's okay. It's not an exam question, but it could be an exam question next week. So do the readings. Okay, so art and literature, we're still with pastoral. So pastoral art, and that could be pastoral literature, usually depicts scenes that are literally pastoral. In fact, what do I mean by that is they're populated by pastures, with people there, shepherds who have sheep. It's a pretty standard thing. Some, like that 19th century American painting I showed you, have cows, but it's still pretty similar. In that sense, it's a form of nature writing or nature art. The problem is, and what I'm about to explain now, is a frustrating fact, and that is that pastoral is not always literal about pastures or the environment, and its consequence is not necessarily nature writing at all. And that's something we just have to deal with here, because we need an understanding of pastoral, because it is the most important art form, really, and certainly literary form dealing with the environment in the West. But it's got this thing going on that it may not be about shepherds or the pastures or anything. Yeah. Just like the word nature, we noted how it's undergone lots of meanings, and the Greek notion of nature is very different from the modern notion of nature. Pastoral can literally be about the environment, and we're going to look at that when it is. But at least as early as Virgil, and we're going to read him for next lecture, it's been a veiled way of talking about something else. So what we would say there, it's not literal, because if it were literal, it would be about the environment in one way or another, but it's allegorical. What's that mean? It's talking about something other than the environment, but using the environment to do it. What could that other thing be? Well, I'll tell you in a minute, but it could be like a political situation or something. So you just need to be clear on this, because otherwise pastoral could throw you. But the problem is it has this long history. It's so pervasive in the West, it's developed this other use as well. Yeah, so how does this work as an allegory? Pastoral provides a relatively safe way of broaching like a political issue, ecclesiastical, which is a way of saying religious issue, or anything like that. So how does it work? Well, you write a story about shepherds experiencing hard times. Why? Not to talk about shepherds. You don't care about shepherds, but you're talking about people feeling hard times, like the economy's bad, and you want to talk about that. How do you do it? Well, we can never forget, we're in a world where we can do that. You could go online yourself and start writing a blog about it. But for most of history, you couldn't do that. Why? Because rulers don't like people being critical of them. If you did something like that, attacking a government for its way of handling the economy, you could very well, and I mean this literally, get your hands cut off for it, or you could be killed for it. So that presents a challenge. How then, if you want to critique a government, if you want to talk about, you're not happy the way the economy is being handled, what do you do? Well, at least as early as Virgil, they came up with, writers and other artists came up with a solution. You write about a couple shepherds. And why? Well, because pastoral is so pervasive, there's pastoral everywhere. Everywhere you look, you see pastoral stories. And these two shepherds are talking about how bad it is, how bad their lives are, how they don't have enough to eat, how it's really hard no matter how hard they work and all. And if you're caught doing this, then it's easy enough saying, well, I'm not talking about politics, I'm talking about a couple of shepherds, and this is just a fanciful story. But it is an effective way of critiquing any number of different sort of, focus of power. So that's how it's allegorical. It's not literally talking about the environment. And in other words, if you read that story literally, you would say, well, those two shepherds, they must have, it must have been a bad season. Maybe it's not raining. Maybe they're in a mega drought like we are or something. No, none of that. So that's where it's going to be a little confusing. A famous example would be Edmund Spenser in 1579 publishes a work called The Shepherd's Calendar. It looks for all intents and purposes like it is a literal calendar. It's actually based on a French calendar, the calendar of shepherds from 100 years before, which was all about like when is the best time of year to plant and things. That's not what Spenser is doing at all. He is critiquing Queen Elizabeth, and he is going pretty hard, actually. But he has to do it in a way because Elizabeth in particular in the early modern period did not like to be critiqued. She had people put to death for it. She had their ears cut off for it. She had their hands cut off for it. She was not nice at all about it. But Spenser becomes a master of this. And the work that you may know or may have heard of is called The Faerie Queene, which he'll publish almost 20 years later. And in The Faerie Queene, he has a full-on attack of Elizabeth. She is the Faerie Queene. But he does it because it's this sort of imaginative world where it's like a pastoral scene, and it's not really Elizabeth, but yet it really is Elizabeth. So it's pastoral in this sense is all over the place. The main thing, this is the big takeaway, it can mask subversive and dangerous political writing. Again, it's a use that doesn't quite click with us today because if you wanted to, critique Joe Biden, our president, you could say pretty much whatever you wanted to other than threatening, I guess, like direct harm to him or something. But for most of history, that's not been the case, and pastoral has been one of the go-to, probably the go-to method of critique. But just to be clear, it can also be a literal form of nature writing. But with Virgil's first Decalogue, which we'll get to next time, we're setting up for it, the allegorical and literal, can intersect because the political implications of what they're talking about can have environmental implications. I'll explain that in detail when we get to Virgil's first Decalogue, but just so that you know, pastoral can be kind of like three things, right? It can be a literal form of nature writing. It can be allegorical as a subversive way of talking about politics or something else, or it could be some combination of those. So the two are intermixed together. And that can be done with great effect environmentally, and it will be by Virgil 3,000 years ago. The important thing is, don't assume that when you get something that's pastoral, that you've encountered nature writing. That if you get the shepherd's calendar and you think that's going to be like a calendar of shepherds, and it's going to be like when you should plant your crops and all, even though Spencer includes things like that, but that's not what he's about at all. He's really doing a political thing. So just know that. I had to spend this time doing a little side trip to allegorical pastoral because I just didn't want you to think that it's all nature writing all the time, because it's not. Okay, pastoral as nostalgic and contemporary. So, especially nostalgic. Pastoral, now we've seen it in a number of cases now, right? We saw the biblical account imagining Eden as this time where human beings had a perfect relationship to the planet before the fall. We saw it with Hesiod imagining this golden race living at a golden time. Pastoral does the same. It is another example of, in this case, an art form which postulates that human beings once had a perfect relationship to the planet that's now lost. And it will sometimes go back in time doing it, but we'll see it's a little more complicated than that. It contributes to that myth, though, that we once had this perfect relationship to the planet, now lost. So you can see why in the West it's going to be so big, right? Because if you don't go with the Judeo-Christian thing, you have the Judeo-Christian thing with the Bible, then you have the Greco-Roman thing with the golden race and golden age, but then you also have this incredibly pervasive art form all telling you the same thing about history. Here's a twist, however. While it can be in the past, in pastoral, it is often postulated that the locus amenus, and remember this is that Latin word for pleasant place, like amiable locale, can also be contemporary in the countryside. And so we see this with Theocritus. And what this means is just that it's not just back in time, like temporally, like way back 6,000 years ago, whenever you imagine the Eden was, but it can be spatially. And what we mean by that is, if you live in where Theocritus lived, actually, Alexandria in Egypt, if you go far enough to the very fringe of civilization, you will still find people living that way. And by the way, you see this in today even. There are peoples that have not had first contact. So if you go far enough, and there are very precious few of these now, but like to the Amazonian basin where modern civilization has not encountered some people, that then you would find that perfect time, that perfect place. But it's not back in time, it's spatially, it's here existing in the now too. But clearly in that case then, you have this country-city dyad reemerging again. So remember with Gilgamesh, you had this binary structure. What's inside of the walls was human culture, and it's good and it's amazing. And read the introduction again where it talks about the fruit trees and the gardens and all that. Yes, and then what's outside is scary and bad. So nature, culture, country, city. What's good, culture. What's bad, nature. What's good, city. What's outside, country is bad. This shifts it. So it's going to be happening at least as early as Theocritus. You still have, the natural and unnatural as this binary structure, but now the good thing is what's outside the city. People, and we even saw this with Hesiod in the 7th century, 4 centuries before Theocritus, that what's in the city, what people have done is the problem. That only, if we could escape that and go way out into the country, then we would be free of all the problems that we have. Environmentally, we've screwed up the planet. We've done it over the centuries. You can imagine an earlier time when it wasn't screwed up, the Golden Age or Eden. But then there's this other thing with pastoral. You can actually go visit that time. It's still here. And people will still believe this, by the way, today. And people will often imagine it's just kind of a little bit in the past when that was here. Yep. Yep. So you can actually visit this place. And that's, I just said it, but I'll say it again. You can't visit Eden. Eden is gone now. It's never to return. You cannot go back to the Golden Age. It's like saying, it's another age in history. And in that sense, the whole thing, the Golden, the Silver Age, and the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, it's a history, right? It's like saying, could you go back to the time of Caesar? No, you can't do that. You can't. But here you can, because it's not temporal, it's not another place, not another time, but it's a place. You have to go pretty far maybe to get to it, but the argument would be the further you go, the closer you'll get to it. So you'll get to rural areas and it'll be nicer and nicer and nicer. But see the underlying problem here, because the underlying problem in this way of thinking is people. People have screwed things up. Either we've done it over the centuries or we do it wherever we inhabit. If you want to go to a place where it's not screwed up, you either have to go far enough back where people weren't screwing things up, or you have to go far enough away where modern culture is not screwing things up. But it creates then that binary structure, right? That people are the problem and that we're not connected with nature in the same way, that we're a corrupter of nature rather than part of it. And we'll talk about that if we get to the essays, the lecture on Buddhism. Yeah. So it does often look back to a simpler time, but that needs to be clarified a little, because often it's somewhere far away. So a classical way that would be understood in the US, and pastoral was very common in the history of the US, and even today, but certainly a generation or two ago, people would say, well, out in the country, people have simpler, better lives. People who live out on farms, it's a simpler, more sustainable way of living. It just fits in with nature, and we've lost that. But oh, that we could be like that, like America 100 years ago, 50 years ago. Pick a time. So it's going back, but it's also going out, because no one's saying, oh, let's go back to see what Brooklyn was like in the 1910 or so. People aren't looking at those places. They're looking at rural places, but often back a little. Some people may feel that those enclaves are still out there, maybe. And when COVID hit and people started leaving the city, in a permanent sense, moving because they could do their jobs remotely, people started going out to very far places in the U.S. countryside where they thought it was nicer. They were trying to escape the city. It's the same story with pastoral. It's been around forever. It's the same story. And where there's this better relationship, maybe even perfect relationship. And that's important because it would be the paradigm that we would all want. Yep. Yep. The notion often is that even now, there are still enclaves of this. I think in the last generation or two, people are less likely to look for that in the continental United States, but we'll look for it for other parts of the world, maybe, where people have it right. Or we'll look for it for people who are living a life like it was 100 or 150 years ago, if there's still communities like that. And it's always going to be then this sort of celebration of country life as a consequence. This is a really important point because pastoral has a way of becoming popular and showing up at different times. And why? Well, often there is something worrisome in the modern world. So in other words, everything's going bad and things are bad, I don't know, politically, economically, whatever. You'll see pastoral artists imagining, a wonderful pastoral place where everything is free of that. So the modern example of it, I guess, would be like cottagecore. So, which is actually really interesting because I don't know that the people producing that are that familiar with the pastoral tradition, yet they are producing pastoral art. And of course, that was really big during the pandemic, right? Everything was going bad, everything was, worrisome and scary and all. And then, don't worry, you have YouTube, you have cottagecore, and you see people sitting in their little cottage out in the middle of nowhere with their little candles and, talking about how they like to make things on their loom and all. You laugh because you know it's true and you've watched this stuff. That's classic pastoral. Not classic in the sense of it's done by Greeks, but that's what pastoral does, and it allows you to imagine a perfect place, and it's pastoral rather than like Eden or the Golden Age, because those people aren't saying that they're actually back in time, they're not reenactors. They're saying, this exists right now, but not where you are, where I am. And if you've actually watched this stuff, you know that it is carefully constructed to get that message out. And we're going to talk about this because pastoral depicts a perfect pastoral country world. It's not accurate at all. I can tell you, I grew up on a farm, and it wasn't anything like any cottagecore that I've ever seen. It just wasn't that pleasant and nice, but okay. Yeah, so that'll be your homework assignment, to go watch some cottagecore when you leave. Only kidding. Here's a classic example and a dark example, I'm afraid. That's the painting I showed you, which looks like this wonderful pastoral place. You see cows here, you see there's a shepherd, but mainly it is just all country. What is this supposed to be? Well, Ashton Brown Durant painted this in 1861 on the eve of the US Civil War. This is a depiction of the American countryside in 1861. How completely much, how much of a break with reality does this have to make? That is not the American countryside in 1861. In 1861, we were preparing the Civil War over the fact that human beings are being forced into slavery and had been for over 100 years in the US. That's not a depiction of the scene of the American countryside. That is a radical, over the top, imagining it as perfect. And why? Because people didn't want to deal with the reality of what was happening. This is no different than like cottagecore, in that people aren't facing up the reality of what's happening. People just want to think of something nice and beautiful and everything's okay and everything's fine and the country is where the great life is, and that's being offered as it. But it's a real break with reality. Oops. Oh, I don't know how that happened, but we'll get back. Where were we on? First off, let's pop this open. Oh no, we were down further, sorry. Okay. It can be somewhat utopian in a way. If you're imagining like a whole group of people there living in this wonderful pastoral place in harmony with nature and all, that can be like a utopian community. But you know, it's to work, it can't be too far back, right? It can't be like 500 years back because it doesn't have that era of reality that something just a few years back or a few decades back. And I think cottagecore does that because it imagines like a simpler time on the American landscape where people lived in cottages rather than, you know, in high-rise apartments. But it can certainly signal a break with reality because the person doing it is no longer depicting anything real, right? You know, maybe that Astrid Brown could be something like some countryside in the US, sure. But is it representative of what's really happening? No, it's completely a break with reality. So, from an environmental perspective, this all matters. So that's what we're doing here. So, here's another one. So what example does Heraclitus use to exemplify nature? So let me just hit this. Let me get rid of this, by the way. Okay. So is it wind? Is it birth? Is it ocean tides? Is it death? Or is it none of these? This one has people a little thrown because you can see the answers are slow coming. The other one, people jumped right in because people knew that Enkidu was Gilgamesh's friend or a wild man. Thinking, thinking, thinking. Wait till we hit 500. There we are. And the answer is, ooh, ooh. Okay. Okay. Anyone want to shout out the right answer? The word. Stream. Stream. I'm sorry, I thought you said E. Stream. E. It is E, a stream or a river. Therefore, see, you all knew it. So you might think from the Enkidu question that they're all going to be easy. It's actually very easy. If I had stream there, I bet you would have gotten it. And I was kidding. That's why people were taking a lot of time because they were like, no, it's not one of those. And it isn't. So I confess that some of them will be a little tricky, like this one. If you feel confident that it's a stream or a river, then just put E. But there will be some like that. So yeah, how about that? I really think you knew I think a lot of people actually knew the right answer. You just were tricked by me, which I find very gratifying that worked. Okay. So back to pastoral and the environmental implications of it. What's ironic about the life depicted in pastoral is that, and Andy Goldsworthy notes this in the film Rivers and Tides, but you didn't see it, and it's really ironic, is that the iconic image that the West came up with to describe a perfect relationship to the planet was shepherds in a pasture with their sheep. Hence, in a pasture, pastoral. That's what it's about. It's like from pasture. The ironic thing is that that is not an environmental ideal, because we saw as early as the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it happened before, we just didn't see it earlier, the West, as I mentioned, has been deforesting. We deforested northern Africa, we went into Europe, we deforested there, we came to the United States, we deforested here, we went into South America after we hit North America, we're deforesting the Amazon basin, we're deforesting the top of the North American continent now with the boreal forest that's where the Alberta tar sands are. But the interesting thing is, how do you keep the area deforested once you deforest it? Because those are ecosystems that are really perfect for producing new trees. There are already probably acorns there. There are probably new small shoots coming up already. Just give it a few years, few decades, maybe to go to maturity a few hundred years and you'll have a forest again. But if you don't want to do that, you don't have heavy machinery, you don't have lawnmowers and all, you have sheep. Sheep are the perfect natural way of deforesting and keeping a deforested area deforested. Why? They're different than cows. Cows, when they eat, they actually just eat grass. They like grass and they eat it. Sheep will eat anything, and they don't just take the grass off the top, they rip up the root and eat the root too. So if you hired someone to keep an area deforested, you'd want them to do exactly what sheep do. You want them to come in and rip up everything and keep the plants from growing by getting the root and all. That's how you do it. So they become this perfect method of maintaining an environment that is anything but natural. The natural environment was destroyed. You bring in sheep to keep it that way. However, throughout history, people didn't have a good handle of their own history in the West, and they thought that that was the original way human beings lived, that human beings lived that pastoral life. Little knowing that there was the darker history, and we saw it with Gilgamesh, where they deforested those areas. Yep. Yeah. We often think of agriculture as involving tilling, and what I mean by that is like plowing and planting, and that's not necessarily the way it works for pastoral people. So they get a lot of what they need from animals that live on the environment. So sheep are a great example. What are people wearing if they have sheep? They're wearing wool that they get from the sheep. They're drinking sheep milk. They're making sheep cheese. They're eating, lamb and mutton, and it's just the way it is. So it's not agriculture like you might think. And when we get to pasture, we get to Georgic, which we're going to see is this alternate form that Virgil also works on, that it's going to involve that tilling and all. But just know that this is a kind of agriculture, even though they didn't really acknowledge it as such. I mean, just having sheep running around is an agricultural project, because they're an introduced species. They're certainly indigenous to none of these places. Yeah. It's not an ideal environmental area. It's not an ideal ecosystem. It is certainly not one unmodified by human beings. Because if you think about it, there's going to be vast species eradication once you cut down a forest. I mean, not only the trees and all the fauna there, but all the animals that made their homes there, the fungus that connect the roots, everything is going to change. Yep. But it was sort of the ideal environmental way of human beings to be for a long time. That's the idea. And it fits into, remember we saw it with both with Heshid, but more maybe with Eden. Remember with Eden, before the fall, there was no labor, right? Mother Earth took care of you. You just went and had nuts and berries or whatever. You didn't have to do hard work. And then Adam gets the punishment of labor for the original sin, what they did. This fits into that because this kind of agricultural practice, you don't need to do a lot of labor. What I mean by that, if you're into tilling, if you're plowing and planting and harvesting and doing all that, but here shepherds are just kind of walking around, and if you see them depicted, they're walking around following their sheep. In some depictions, the sheep are following them. There's a whole history of the difference, it doesn't matter, but they're not really doing anything. They like to write poems and all, that's what they do. Yep. They're usually doing things like having singing matches, which is writing poetry, basically, like who comes up with the best songs. And again, it is much like prelapsarian Eden. In other words, Eden before the fall, when everything was great. So you can see how this is it's even more complicated explaining that things are great, right? So it fits in perfectly with the golden age, the age when this didn't happen, or Eden before the fall, where everything is just wonderful. And you just don't have to do anything but enjoy it and sing songs. Yeah, just a little aside. Poets like this so much because what the shepherds are actually doing, they're singing songs, but they're lyrics, right? And lyric and lyrical poetry come from the same root. So, and you know this, right? Song lyrics are basically poems. Good ones are, anyhow. So they saw themselves, the poets writing these stories, like the shepherds themselves. They fancied themselves like shepherds. And sometimes you can see it gets a little blurry. They kind of start believing that they're in the scene. They write themselves into it, for sure. That happens a lot. Spenser writes himself into his works. Yep. This is an important point. Let me get a drink before I run into it. Pastoral is the view of the pasture from the living room window. In other words, pastoral is not the view of the pasture from out in the field where the shepherds and sheep are. So let me explain what I mean by that here. Pastoral, and this is kind of surprising, rarely written by people in the countryside. Rather, and I say here ironically, pastoral is largely an urban art form. So just stop and think about that. The most popular way of talking about the natural world in the West is by people who do not inhabit the places that they're writing about. They're writing about it from what they see as the opposite, the city, and from the perspective of the city. It depicts life in the countryside as leisurely and perfect, which of course is rarely the case. So, for example, in the early modern period, we're talking about like Spenser and Shakespeare's era, how this worked is every major writer in England, for example, writing pastoral is writing it from London. It's the biggest city in the West, and growing all the time. But it's by people who really don't have a direct hands-on experience of the countryside. Instead, they are imagining a fanciful life in the countryside, an idealized life in the countryside. If someone were actually, and by the 18th century we'll get a few people doing it, actually writing from the position of the countryside, it may be very different. We're actually going to see it. Shakespeare in As You Like It, which we'll read, has a character, Corin, who is meant to be an actual shepherd for the first time. But for the most part, know that, and you can see already one of the conspicuous features of pastoral is going to be wildly idealized. It's going to be an idealized version of the country from the perspective of the city. In other words, the way that a person in the city imagines the country, not the way a person in the country imagines their life, their life. Yep. It can be, so why would people be doing this, imagining this perfect countryside, life there? Well, it's often in response to a problem. So you saw that with the painting from the Civil War era. That was a problem politically, and to escape that, the artist depicted a perfect countryside, which would not have been where he was from. He was probably painting this in a city somewhere. Maybe he went out to the countryside and got did some sketches and all, but for the most part it was by someone from the city. But, and this matters from our point of view, it can also be response to an environmental problem itself. In other words, obviously a political problem with the Civil War, that could prompt pastoral, but also it could be an environmental one when the environment is endangered. And what would we imagine then? Well, we'll talk about this directly, someplace free of danger. Rachel Carson is the last work that we read from is from Silent Spring, which inaugurates the modern environmental era in the early 1960s. She opens Silent Spring in a very pastoral way. She imagines a scene not unlike any of the other pastoral scenes that came before it, where everything is nice in rural America, everything is fine, and she spends the first, it's the first 3 pages of the book, but she does it for a very specific reason, because she wants to tell you that something is really wrong, and she invokes the pastoral scene. And I won't give away too much, but Silent Spring, the title, is denoting that there is now a spring where it's silent because all the birds are dead. So how does she set that up? She first starts talking about how wonderful it is to go out into the country where everyone is happy and everything is fine, perfect pastoral locus amenus, and you hear bird songs everywhere you go. In the spring especially, it's a wonderful time where you hear bird songs. And then she completely changes gear and said, but now when you go to the country, it's silent. The springs are silent. Why? This chemical DDT, if you don't know how DDT works, DDT kills insects, but it also acts on other animals as well, especially birds. And what it does to birds is particularly insidious and horrible, is it makes their eggs thin. Very thin, so much so that they may not even, a hen may not even be able to lay an egg before it breaks, or while sitting on them, the eggs break, so that it decimates the population of birds where you're spraying DDT. Hence, it's a silent spring because of it. But anyhow, she first gets you caring about this because you imagine a wonderful pastoral place. So, environmental consciousness, can we see those? Yeah. So, if an artist has developed an environmental consciousness, an awareness of a problem, Rachel Carson's an example of one. You know, they're aware of a problem like she was, but then it raises the question, how do you communicate that to someone else? And that's the challenge for the artist or anyone who would communicate an environmental problem. So let me explain how this works. It's often the case that you're not fully aware of the environment into which you're born. It's always there, but sometimes we don't pay a lot of attention to it. So the easiest way to understand this, I think, is by analogy. Say you have a really close friend, and you've had this friend for a long time, for years and years. I think there's, you know, human nature being what it is. Sometimes we kind of forget how special they are as friends. We sort of take them for granted. We don't think about the friendship from one day to the next, even though it's central to us. And when does it become an issue? When it's endangered. So suddenly there's some problem, your friendship isn't working, someone moves away, someone gets very ill, and then suddenly the friendship in all its features explodes into view. Suddenly you become aware of it, mindful of it. And it happens only when something's going wrong. So that analogy works here. You live in an environment, say you live in Santa Barbara, I'm going to use it as an example in a minute, and you take for granted how wonderful it is, how amazing our beaches are, how amazing it is just to go walk along the beach. What could possibly make you aware of that environment? The answer is if something goes wrong. You become both aware of it and aware of it as endangered. So it's not just like, you know, like the friendship. It's not just you see the friendship for what it is. That would be great, but you also see that it's endangered. That person may be leaving for one reason or another, and then you suddenly see it for what it is. But ironically, only at the very moment when it's endangered. And unfortunately, that's kind of how it works with human nature. We shouldn't, so everyone should leave here thinking of friendships that they don't think about all the time and realize how important they are. But you should also do it with environments too. And this is important because, well, we'll see, it's what we mean by environmental consciousness. So here's the example. 1969, people had lived in Santa Barbara, obviously, for a long, long time. People may have actually walked out on the beach every day. People like to run on the beach, visit the beach every day. I love to visit Santa Barbara beaches. But there's this horrible oil spill, and that oil spill suddenly made people aware of their beaches. What do I mean by that? Well, they knew the beaches. They were walking on the beach. They knew they lived on a beach and all. Maybe. I mean, sure, in one sense. But in another sense, they just weren't aware of how precious they were and how important they were to them. And they became aware of that at the moment of the endangerment. When suddenly you saw the things that, there's oil on the beach, there are dead birds on the beach, nothing is like it is. And suddenly you saw it for what it was. Not then, which you would, but before that happened. That became a milestone event, by the way. So 1960s, the modern environmental movement takes off, in part, that's started by Rachel Carson in 1962 with the publication of Silent Spring. But as the decade ended, the Santa Barbara oil spill, most people would argue, is one of the 2 or 3, along with the publication of Silent Spring, events that brought about the modern environmental movement in the United States. So it was might forget, but here in Santa Barbara, we're like at the locus of where this began. And it's just of great importance environmentally. Yep. So Rachel Carson, similarly in Silent Spring, what she does, she becomes aware of a problem, not by just walking out and seeing dead birds everywhere. I think that might have been part of it, but I think mainly through her research. The more research she did, the bigger the problem appeared to her. And just like walking out on the beach and seeing a bunch of dead birds, through her research, she saw this happening and developed an environmental consciousness, realizing that something was profoundly wrong, that it wasn't a perfect locus coeminus, that something had happened. But then she's going to have a challenge as an artist or a writer, and that is, how do you communicate that in the reader? So in other words, she, through her own experience, maybe through reading, but it's still her experience, she develops an environmental consciousness. She wants to convey it to other people. How can you do it? If you lived in Santa Barbara in 1969, you could probably do that pretty easily. You could just grab someone by the arm and say, come with me, you have to come to the beach, and then you will see what the problem is. A writer doesn't have that benefit. You can't physically take someone to a place. You have to be able to do it in words. So what they often do will be to gesture to the environment. The same as like bringing someone to the beach, to gesture to it. And which one would that be? Well, you think about it, you have 2 options. One, you could take the person to an endangered beach where the oil is and the dead birds and all, or you could take someone to a pristine beach and say, look, see how precious this is. Everything is working the way it should. You kind of have either way, and we're going to see examples of both because pastoral functions this way. Because it's traditionally written by urban poets for an urban audience, they generally draw attention to the pristine countryside. And I think that's what you may have thought of maybe before this class, what you thought of what nature writing is. What do I mean by that? Well, you thought this class is probably going to be a bunch of poems about nature and how beautiful it is and how wonderful it is and how amazing Yosemite is or whatever. They do a lot of that. Pastoral does an awful lot of that. It's the difficulty is they don't draw attention to the problem area. So we saw that with the painting from the Civil War era. It doesn't draw attention to the problem. It just draws attention to an idealized, wonderful place. So they're looking, at the countryside, but it's kind of an odd thing because what you're really seeing is an inverted image of the problems that they have. The author is thinking about the urban environment, but instead wrote about its opposite. So here I am, I'm looking over at the city, I see all the problems with the city and people don't get along and it's environmentally a nightmare and all. And instead of writing about that, I do a 180 and I write about the opposite, where everything is perfect, where people get along, environmentally it's wonderful, it's beautiful, it's just a perfect world. That's the maneuver that many pastoral artists do. That's why I said it's like a disconnect from reality, because they just don't want to deal with the problems. They just want to imagine a place free of those problems. Yep. So, yeah. in a way, you know, if you read one of those artists, and we're going to read one of them with Wordsworth especially. Wordsworth is writing at a time when the Industrial Revolution is taking off, and Thoreau is too, actually, and yet neither of them talk much about the Industrial Revolution at all. But if you read what they're writing about, if you read it carefully, you'll see they're actually talking about the problems, because they don't want to deal with the problems, and they're saying, you know, the world is a problem, people aren't nice to each other, people are being forced into horrible working conditions and all. And instead they'll say, oh, everyone's nice to each other. Working conditions, they're great. People are outside all day, they're walking around with their sheep. It's pleasant and wonderful. So if you imagine the opposite of so many of the depictions, you'll get a view of what they're actually turning away from. It's ironic, and I'll just mention it. Part of the problem is that because we have all this pastoral art, we have pushing 3,000 years of it, people will often, for many centuries really, people read earlier pastoral art and they said, you know, the Greeks, they really lived at peace with the planet. Look at all the pastoral art they have. You know, what was life like for the average person in Greece? They were walking around with their sheep, they were having singing matches. It was really wonderful. And you'll get it even with things like that, the painting from the Civil War. What was it like, you know, 1860 in the American South? It was wonderful, wasn't it? People just, you know, were out there with their cows and all. If you're not careful, you can actually buy into the depictions and imagine that's what it is, rather than the horror, in some cases, like 1860s in the US, that were going on. So you have to be really careful, because if you take them at face value, it may seem indeed to be pretty perfect. So you can see how this helps promote that idea. So say you read Greek pastoral, it promotes the idea that for the average person in Greece, in, you know, Theocritus' time, 2,300 years ago, it was pretty perfect, and human beings lived pretty harmoniously with nature. And they actually knew it, because if you read it, they tell you how happy they are and that they were at peace with nature. But again, it's not accurate at all. The very fact that it's being depicted maybe should signal to you that there's something wrong. And arguably, the nicer it's depicted and the more over the top the depictions, it should signal that there's a bigger problem. So if someone's telling you everything is fine, that should be a signal that, well, yeah, nothing is fine. So if you've thought about what I just said, you know, instead of looking at problems, you turn around, turn away from them, and imagine a world free of those problems. It should suggest that what if you look straight on, head on at the problems? Rachel Carson does in Silent Spring. She starts off by imagining a perfect pastoral place, and the rest of the book squarely takes on the problems unflinchingly. What would that be like? So we're going to see some pictures, some paintings, some photographs of that. You could call this kind of anti-pastoral, because instead of looking at an imagining a perfect environmental scene, it's looking at the opposite, what gave birth to that, the problems that made people want to go ahead and imagine something. And an example is Ed Burtynsky, a good film. I'll put it on GauchoCast if you want to watch it. Documentary, Manufactured Landscapes, from 2007, I think. But let me show you some images and I'll explain how this works, and that'll wrap us up. So this is one of Burtynsky's his photographs. He does photographs that are huge. They're much taller than I am. And he used to do them with a camera, but now he does them with a film camera. Now he does them digitally. But there should be something that seems familiar about that, because that looks like a totally alien landscape. It's gesturing to something else, and that's this, right? If you look at it, it's like, this is what a stream should be. It is, you know, everything is nice about it. that the stream is there, and I'll mention in a minute how everything is growing around it, everything is alive. That's what a natural scene should be. Burtynsky wants to give you the opposite so that you can see how bad it is. So note here, everything around this is alive, right? You can see it's kind of like, it's not as green as you get further out because this stream or river is what's supplying all this water to make this happen. But on the opposite here, as Burtynsky just does such a wonderful job, he takes this picture in the winter so that everything is dead there, so that there's just nothing alive here. It's meant to show you what goes wrong, but it's meant to make you think of a river. Everything is just dead. So it's kind of the opposite, but it draws attention to endangered and pristine environments. So how does he do that? Instead, so he's looking, like I said, like looking straight at a problem like the city and showing it to you. But when you see it, it invokes in your mind the opposite of that, the opposite of the city. So I'm just rolling through these so we can finish. You can see why this would be a more popular art form now in the 21st, in that people know that there's a problem, and maybe we want from our artists to unflinchingly look at the problems. Ed Burtynsky is kind of that part of a new generation. This is another picture that he does, and photograph that he does. This is coal, and he wants to make you think of something else. What else? It looks like rolling hills. That's the idea, to make you think of another issue. So the thing to realize here is, what is the true subject here? In pastoral, the subject in the traditional pastoral for a couple thousand years, the subject was the perfect, pristine environment. Here, it shifted up, that now we're looking at the true subject, which is why this type of pastoral, what I'm calling anti-pastoral here, is so effective because it faces the environmental issues. Yep. Traditional pastoral can gesture to two things too. And I'll just go through some images here and then I'll take roll. This is another one, Burtynsky's images. This is, if you actually see it, it's huge. It's almost as tall as the screen. And these are two ships, but it's interesting to think about what is actually being depicted here. This is the ocean, right? What they do, this is in Bangladesh, they take these ships ashore and then people go out and cut them up and get the constituent metal. So if you ever wonder how recycling takes place, yeah, that's what you're actually thinking about, our beautiful Santa Barbara coast. Here's another example, stream on top of a river, on top of a mountain. Here's another example, just wait, just wait. Maybe the most amazing one of all, this is a valley, but this was actually a mountain before mountaintop removal to create that, which is how we get minerals and things like coal. But it's meant to look like that. Okay, one last time. Did you enjoy those artwork, Edward Burtynsky? Okay. So once you've answered, you can leave unless you want to wait and see what people think. Hey, this one people didn't deliberate at all. They answered it really quickly. Yes, very much. Good. Okay, so lecture number 7 on Thursday.